On the morning of April 29, 1945, Corporal James Mitchell stood at the gates of a makeshift prisoner compound outside Heidelberg, Germany, watching a transport truck unload its cargo of human misery. What the 23-year-old military policeman from rural Kansas witnessed that morning would shatter every assumption he'd carried across the Atlantic about the nature of enemy and ally, guilt and innocence, victor and vanquished. Thursday morning. They gave us bread and ersatz coffee before we left the processing center at Mannheim. 17 women stumbled from the truck bed, their gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms hanging like shrouds on skeletal frames. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, the oldest perhaps 45, though starvation had aged them all beyond recognition. They moved with the shuffle of the elderly, hands clutching at each other for support, eyes downcast in the defeated posture Corporal Mitchell had seen in countless prisoners. But something about this group struck him differently. These weren't combat soldiers. They were signals operators, clerks, and medical assistants who had served behind the lines, women who had answered their nation's call for non-combat personnel as Germany's manpower dwindled. The compound commander, Captain Howard Brennan, emerged from the administrative tent with his clipboard, barely glancing at the new arrivals. Process them standard, medical screening, delousing, then into Barracks 7 with the other auxiliaries. Make sure they understand the rules. No special treatment. Corporal Mitchell nodded, but his attention had fixed on one woman near the front of the group. She wore the insignia of the signals corporal, and despite her obvious exhaustion, she maintained a rigid military bearing, her chin lifted in defiance even as her legs trembled. When their eyes met, Mitchell saw something he hadn't expected. Not hatred or fear, but a profound exhaustion that transcended the physical. This was a woman who had watched her entire world collapse and was still trying to stand upright in its ruins. "Name and unit," Mitchell said in his careful, textbook German, addressing the woman with the corporal's insignia. "Obergefreiter Margarete Hoffman, Nachrichtenhelferin, serial number 4782B. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but each word was precisely articulated, a small act of dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Mitchell consulted his roster, running his finger down the list of expected arrivals. "Says here you were supposed to arrive 3 days ago. What happened?" Marguerite's composure cracked slightly. "The transport was delayed. There were complications with the route. We were held at a temporary facility." "What kind of facility?" She didn't answer immediately. Behind her, one of the younger women swayed dangerously, her eyes rolling back. Mitchell moved instinctively, catching her before she hit the ground. The woman weighed almost nothing, her wrist bones prominent beneath his fingers like a bird's hollow skeleton. He looked at Marguerite with sudden understanding. "When did you last eat?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. Thursday. Today was Monday. 5 days. These women had been in American custody for 5 days without adequate food. He laid the unconscious woman gently on the ground and turned to his assistant, Private Danny Kowalski. "Get the medic, now, and bring water, whatever rations you can find in the supply tent." Captain Brennan had moved on to inspect another section of the compound, but Sergeant Frank Morrison, the administrative NCO, approached with his characteristic bureaucratic precision. "What's the holdup, Corporal? Get them processed and into the barracks. We've got another transport coming in at 1400. "Sir, these women haven't eaten in 5 days. One just collapsed. They need medical attention and food before processing." Morrison's expression didn't change. "They're enemy combatants in American custody. The Geneva Convention requires we feed them equivalent to our own rear echelon troops, which we do once they're processed and in the system. Until then, they're in transit, and transit regulations apply." "Transit regulations don't include starving prisoners, Sergeant." "Watch your tone, Corporal." Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. "These women served the Nazi regime. They transmitted orders that sent Wehrmacht units to murder civilians. They processed paperwork that kept the camps running. Don't let a pretty face make you forget who we're dealing with." Mitchell looked back at the group of women. Several others were now sitting on the ground, lacking the strength to stand. The medic, a weary-looking corporal named Stevens, was checking the unconscious woman's pulse and shaking his head. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, probably dysentery. This one needs immediate hospitalization. Honestly, they all do. Private Kowalski returned with his arms full of C-ration cans and canteens. This is all I could grab, Corporal. The mess sergeant says the next meal service isn't until 1800, 6 hours away. Mitchell made a decision that he knew would probably cost him his stripes. Distribute those rations now, all of them. Stevens, get a vehicle ready to transport the worst cases to the field hospital. Corporal Mitchell, Sergeant Morrison's voice carried the edge of direct warning. I'm ordering you to cease this unauthorized distribution and process these prisoners according to regulation. Is that clear? Crystal clear, sir. Mitchell turned to face Morrison directly. And I'm respectfully informing you that I intend to disobey that order. These women are dying. I watched my brother die of pneumonia when I was 12 because we waited too long to get him to a doctor. I'm not watching 17 more people die because some transit regulation says they have to wait 6 more hours for food. The confrontation might have escalated, but Captain Brennan had noticed the commotion and returned to investigate. He took in the scene quickly. The collapsed woman, the medic's concerned expression, the C-rations being distributed, and his 2 NCOs locked in a standoff. Someone want to explain what's happening here? Mitchell spoke first, keeping his voice level and professional. Sir, these prisoners arrived severely malnourished after 5 days without adequate food in transit. I made the call to provide emergency rations and medical transport. Sergeant Morrison disagrees with my assessment. Brennan looked at the women, really looked at them for the first time. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He was a career officer, 20 years in the service, a veteran of North Africa, Normandy. He'd seen plenty of prisoners, plenty of suffering. But something about this particular scene seemed to penetrate his professional detachment. Stevens, your medical opinion. Sir, advanced starvation. At least 4 of them need immediate hospitalization. The rest need supervised feeding to avoid refeeding syndrome. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. You can't just starve someone for days and give them regular rations. Their systems can't handle it. Could kill them. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decision. Mitchell, you're coming with me. Bring those women to the hospital, all of them. Sergeant Morrison, I want a full report on my desk within the hour about how prisoners in American custody went 5 days without adequate food. And I want the names of every officer who signed off on their transport. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The decision Corporal Mitchell made that April morning occurred at a unique moment in history, when the certainties of war were giving way to the moral complexities of occupation. The collapse of Nazi Germany had revealed horrors that defied comprehension. Photographs from liberated concentration camps had circulated among Allied troops for weeks, creating a psychological environment in which every German was potentially complicit in unimaginable evil. This context made Mitchell's instinctive compassion for enemy prisoners not just unusual, but actively controversial among his fellow soldiers. The American military's relationship with German prisoners of war had evolved dramatically over the course of the conflict. In the early years, when Nazi Germany appeared invincible, captured German soldiers were treated with a mixture of professional respect and cautious wariness. They were formidable enemies who had conquered most of Europe, and their military professionalism commanded a grudging admiration even from their captors. By 1945, however, this dynamic had fundamentally changed. The liberation of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen had exposed the systematic extermination that the Nazi regime had perpetrated. American soldiers who had fought their way across France and Germany had witnessed firsthand the results of Wehrmacht occupation policies in destroyed villages and murdered civilians. In this atmosphere, compassion for German prisoners became morally complicated. Many American troops questioned whether people who had served Hitler's regime deserved the protections of international law.
The women of the Wehrmacht auxiliary services occupied a particularly ambiguous space in this moral landscape. Unlike combat soldiers, they had not directly engaged in violence. Yet their roles as communication specialists, administrative clerks, and medical support personnel had been essential to the Nazi war machine's functioning. Every message they transmitted, every order they processed, every wounded soldier they treated had contributed to a regime that had murdered millions. Mitchell himself had carried these moral complications across the Atlantic. His unit had liberated a small forced labor camp outside of Cologne 3 weeks earlier, finding dozens of emaciated prisoners, mostly Polish and Russian civilians, who had been worked nearly to death in a factory producing artillery shells. The German civilians in the nearby town had claimed ignorance, insisting they knew nothing about the conditions in the camp despite its proximity to their homes. Mitchell had found their denials infuriating, a transparent attempt to escape responsibility for atrocities committed in their midst. He had no illusions about German innocence. Yet when he looked at Margarete Hoffman and the other women stumbling from that transport truck, starved and exhausted, something in him refused to accept that deliberate cruelty toward prisoners was an appropriate response to German crimes. His father, a Methodist minister in a small Kansas town, had raised him with a simple principle that he called the irreducible standard. There are certain things you don't do to another human being regardless of what they've done to you. You don't torture, you don't starve, you don't humiliate for the sake of humiliation. These weren't weaknesses or naive sentimentality. They were the boundaries that separated civilization from barbarism, lines that once crossed corrupted the crosser as much as the victim. The field hospital that received the 17 women was a converted secondary school on the outskirts of Heidelberg, its classrooms transformed into wards, its gymnasium into a surgical theater. Major Catherine Riley, the chief nursing officer, took one look at the new arrivals and immediately mobilized her entire staff. Within minutes, the women were distributed among beds, receiving intravenous fluids and careful medical assessments. Major Riley had served in North Africa and Italy before transferring to Germany, and she had treated thousands of casualties from every army in the theater. But the systematic neglect evident in these patients triggered a particular anger in her. "This isn't war wounds," she told Mitchell as they stood in the corridor outside the ward. "This is administrative indifference. Someone along the transport chain decided these prisoners weren't worth the trouble of proper care, so they just warehoused them without adequate provisions. It's lazy, cruel, and frankly, it makes us look like the barbarians the Nazi propaganda always claimed we were." Mitchell had expected the medical staff to be indifferent or even hostile toward German prisoners. Instead, he found himself witnessing the same professional dedication that Major Riley's nurses showed to American patients. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a nurse whose parents had emigrated from China, worked alongside Private First Class Rebecca Goldstein, whose entire extended family in Poland had been murdered in the Holocaust, as they carefully monitored the refeeding process for the most severely malnourished women. Both nurses treated their patients with gentle efficiency, adjusting IV drips, checking vital signs, offering words of reassurance in careful German. "How do you do it?" Mitchell asked Goldstein during a quiet moment. "After everything the Nazis did, how do you care for German prisoners?"
Goldstein didn't answer immediately. She finished adjusting a blanket around one of the sleeping women before turning to face him. "My grandmother always said that vengeance belongs to God, not to nurses. These women are patients now, not soldiers. Maybe they did terrible things. Probably they did. But starving them won't bring back my family. It'll just make me into someone my grandmother wouldn't recognize." She paused, looking down at the woman she'd just covered. "Besides, look at her hands. You see those calluses? She was a pianist before the war. My grandmother played piano too. Chopin was her favorite. This woman probably played the same pieces. Music doesn't have a nationality. Neither does suffering." Margarete Hoffman regained consciousness in the early evening, her eyes focusing slowly on the unfamiliar surroundings of the hospital ward. For a moment,
Confusion clouded her features, then recognition, and something like fear. She tried to sit up, but Lieutenant Chan gently pressed her back down. "You're in the hospital. You collapsed from malnutrition. You're receiving intravenous fluids and nutrients. Don't try to move yet." "The others?" Marguerite's voice was hoarse. "All here, all receiving treatment. You were the least severe case, which is why you're awake already." Marguerite's eyes found Mitchell, standing near the door. "You brought us here! The captain ordered it because of you!" "The captain made the decision. I just pointed out that you needed help." "Why?" The question carried genuine confusion. "We are the enemy! Your people have seen what we did, what our army did, the camps. We saw the photographs. Your soldiers made the townspeople look at them, made them bury the bodies. Why would you help us after that?" Mitchell pulled a chair closer to her bed and sat down. "Can I ask you something? Did you know about the camps, about what was happening there?" Marguerite was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I knew there were camps. We all knew that. The regime made no secret of arresting enemies of the state. Jews, communists, partisans. They told us it was necessary for security, that these people were dangerous to Germany." She closed her eyes.
I told myself it was like your Japanese internment camps. Unjust, perhaps, but temporary. A wartime measure. I did not know about the murder. Not until the end. Not until everything collapsed and the stories began to spread. Even then, I thought it must be exaggeration, propaganda. It wasn't until I saw one of your photographs that I understood the truth. And now I understand that I was complicit. I transmitted the orders. I helped coordinate the logistics that kept the Wehrmacht functioning. Every message I sent helped sustain the regime that built those camps. I did not pull the triggers or operate the gas chambers, but I was part of the machine that made them possible. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Mitchell. So I ask again, why help us? Mitchell thought about his father's sermons, about irreducible standards and the boundaries of civilization. Because we're not fighting to become what we're fighting against. If we win this war by becoming as cruel as the Nazis, then what exactly have we won? Just a different version of the same brutality. Margaret's expression remained troubled. That sounds very noble, but I've seen what your bombers did to our cities. I've heard the stories from the Eastern Front about what the Russians do to German prisoners. The world is not noble. It is brutal and unforgiving. Maybe, but that doesn't mean we have to add to the brutality. Every time we choose to do the right thing, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, we push back against that brutality a little bit. Maybe it doesn't change the world, but it changes us. And maybe that's enough. Over the following days, as the 17 women slowly recovered under Major Riley's care, Corporal Mitchell found himself returning to the hospital whenever his duties allowed. He told himself it was to ensure the prisoners were being properly processed and prepared to transfer to a permanent POW camp. But truthfully, he was drawn by a need to understand something that he couldn't quite articulate: how ordinary people had participated in extraordinary evil, and what that meant for his own capacity to distinguish between justice and vengeance. The women themselves represented a cross-section of wartime Germany. Margarete Hoffman had been a university student in Munich before the war, studying mathematics with dreams of becoming a teacher. When the Wehrmacht began recruiting women for auxiliary services in 1941, she had volunteered, viewing it as her patriotic duty. Beside her in the ward lay Elsa Brenner, a former factory worker from the Ruhr Valley who had joined to escape the grinding poverty of her industrial hometown. There was Greta Schumacher,
a banker's daughter from Hamburg whose family had been prominent members of the Nazi Party, and Hilda Wagner, whose father had been imprisoned for socialist activities in 1934 and who had joined the auxiliary hoping to protect her family from further persecution by demonstrating their loyalty. Each woman carried her own story of how she had come to serve the regime, and each now faced the devastating realization that their service had contributed to atrocities beyond their darkest imaginings. Private Goldstein, despite her initial reservations, began spending her breaks talking with the patients, trying to understand how decent people had enabled such horror. One evening, Mitchell heard her in intense conversation with Greta Schumacher, the banker's daughter. "My parents believed Hitler had saved Germany," Greta was saying, her voice defensive despite her weakened condition. "We were starving during the inflation. My father's savings became worthless overnight. Then Hitler came, and suddenly there were jobs, food, pride. We weren't the defeated humiliation of Versailles anymore. We were strong again. Yes, there were things we didn't like, the violence against Jews, the censorship, but we told ourselves these were temporary excesses, the growing pains of national renewal. And when it kept getting worse, when the Nuremberg laws passed, when the synagogues burned," Goldstein's voice was controlled, but Mitchell could hear the pain beneath it. "We told ourselves we didn't know how bad it was, that the foreign press exaggerated, that if we just kept our heads down and did our jobs, eventually things would moderate. It's easy to judge us now, knowing how it ended, but when you're in the middle of it, when questioning means losing your job or worse, when everyone around you is going along, it's harder than you think to be the one who stands apart. My grandmother stood apart. She hid 3 Jewish families in Berlin for 2 years. She was caught in 1943 and sent to Ravensbrück. She died there 6 months before liberation." The ward fell silent. Greta turned her face to the wall, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Goldstein stood there for a moment. Then, in a gesture that surprised even herself, reached out and placed a hand on Greta's shoulder. "I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you because it was hard to stand apart isn't enough. It has to be enough to make you stand apart next time for whoever comes after us." Mitchell watched this exchange and understood something that the propaganda posters and war films had never captured. The actual moral landscape of war was far more complicated than simple narratives of good versus evil. These women had made choices, some out of genuine belief, some out of fear, some out of simple carelessness about where their choices led. They bore responsibility for those choices, yet they were also themselves victims of a system that had corrupted their society from within, turning ordinary human weaknesses into machinery of genocide. The question that haunted Mitchell was whether showing mercy to these women betrayed the victims of Nazi atrocities, or whether mercy was precisely what prevented the victors from becoming the next generation of perpetrators. His father would have said that mercy and justice weren't opposites, but partners, that you could hold people accountable for their actions while still treating them humanely. Sitting in that hospital ward, watching nurses who had every reason to hate their patients, instead carefully monitoring their recovery, Mitchell began to understand what his father had meant. On the 5th day, Captain Brennan arrived at the hospital with news. The investigation into the transport conditions had revealed a systematic failure of oversight at the Transit Processing Center in Mannheim. Prisoners awaiting transfer had been held in overcrowded conditions with inadequate food and water due to what the report termed administrative inefficiency. 3 officers had been relieved of duty and new protocols were being implemented for all prisoner transports. "The report recommends commendation for your actions, Corporal," Brennan told Mitchell. "You potentially saved 17 lives through your quick thinking and willingness to challenge orders you believed were unjust." Mitchell felt uncomfortable with the praise.
"I just did what seemed right, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "No, Corporal, they wouldn't have. That's precisely the point." Brennan looked through the window at the recovering women. "I've been in this army for 20 years. I've seen good men do terrible things because they were following orders. I've seen decent people look away from suffering because acknowledging it was inconvenient. What you did took moral courage, which is rarer and more valuable than physical courage." He turned back to Mitchell. "The question is, what do we do now? These women will recover, and then they'll need to be transferred to a permanent POW facility. But I'm told you've been spending considerable time here. Have you learned anything useful? Anything we should know about conditions in other German auxiliary units? Strategic intelligence?" Mitchell shook his head. "They're not strategic assets, sir. They're just women who made bad choices and are now trying to figure out how to live with the consequences. But I have learned something, I think. I've learned that maintaining our humanity toward our enemies might be the most important battle we fight. Because if we lose that, if we let cruelty become standard practice, then it doesn't matter what we win. We'll have already lost something essential." Captain Brennan studied the younger man for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Write that up in your report, Corporal. I think people back home need to hear it. This war is almost over, but the peace is going to be complicated."
We'll need men who understand the difference between justice and revenge. As Brennan left, Mitchell returned to the ward, where Major Riley was conducting evening rounds. Margarete Hoffman was sitting up now, color returning to her face, though her eyes still carried the weight of someone who had watched their world collapse. She saw Mitchell and offered a tentative smile. "Corporal Mitchell, I wanted to thank you, not just for the food and medical care, but for treating us as human beings. I know what your people have discovered about my country. I know that you have every reason to hate us. The fact that you chose compassion instead gives me hope that perhaps there is a path forward, some way to atone for what we allowed to happen." Mitchell pulled up the chair beside her bed. "What will you do after the war when you're released?" "If I'm released," she corrected. "I expect to face charges, war crimes perhaps, or at minimum collaboration. I transmitted orders that directed Wehrmacht units. I am not innocent, even if I did not know the full extent of what I was enabling." "But if you are released," Marguerite was quiet, staring at her hands. "I was studying to be a mathematics teacher before all this. Perhaps I will return to that, if any school would have me. I want to teach young people to think critically, to question authority, to understand that I was just following orders is not a moral justification. Perhaps if someone had taught my generation those lessons, we would not have followed our orders straight into hell." "That sounds like a good plan." "It sounds like penance," Marguerite corrected, "which is what I deserve." She looked up at Mitchell, her eyes intense. "I need you to understand something. Your mercy toward us, it doesn't erase our guilt. It doesn't make what we did acceptable. But it does show us that there is a difference between your people and the regime we served. You had the power to hurt us, and you chose not to. That choice matters. It matters because it shows that human beings are capable of maintaining moral standards even when circumstances would excuse their abandonment. That is the lesson I will carry forward, the one piece of light I can salvage from these dark years." Through the window, the sun was setting over Heidelberg, its light painting the ruined city in shades of gold and amber. American soldiers walked the streets where Wehrmacht troops had marched just weeks before. In hospital wards throughout the city, nurses from Kansas and California tended to wounded from both armies, maintaining standards of care that transcended nationality and ideology. It was a fragile peace, built on individual choices to maintain humanity in circumstances that would excuse its absence. Corporal Mitchell understood that what happened in this hospital ward wouldn't change the course of history. The war would end, the trials would proceed, and the long, difficult work of rebuilding Europe would continue regardless of whether 17 German women received compassionate care from their captors.
But sitting beside Margarete Hoffman's bed, watching her struggle to reconcile her actions with her conscience, he understood that perhaps the most important battles weren't the ones that changed history, but the ones that preserved the possibility of redemption, the small choices that maintained the boundaries between justice and vengeance, between necessary force and unnecessary cruelty. Outside, Captain Brennan was already drafting his report, recommending policy changes that would ensure no more prisoners languish without adequate food in administrative limbo. Private Goldstein was beginning her night shift, carrying with her a complicated understanding that the granddaughter of a Holocaust victim could provide compassionate care to former Nazi auxiliaries without betraying her grandmother's memory. Major Riley was reviewing supply requisitions, ensuring her hospital had enough resources to treat every patient regardless of which uniform they had worn. These were small acts, mundane decisions that would never appear in history books or war memorials. Yet each represented a choice to maintain standards of human decency in circumstances that would excuse their abandonment. Each was a quiet affirmation that even in the darkest circumstances, even toward former enemies, even knowing what atrocities they had enabled, it remained possible to choose mercy without surrendering justice. As night fell over Heidelberg, 17 women slept in clean beds with adequate food in their stomachs and medical care for their ailments, alive because one corporal from Kansas had decided that certain standards were worth maintaining regardless of circumstances. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of the war's end, but for those 17 women, and for the young corporal who would carry this moment with him for the rest of his life, it was everything. The transformation that occurred in that Heidelberg hospital ward over the following weeks reflected a broader shift in how American forces approached the occupation of defeated Germany. The discovery of concentration camps had initially created an atmosphere of collective punishment, a desire to make all Germans confront the horrors their regime had perpetrated. Yet, as soldiers like Corporal Mitchell interacted daily with individual Germans, the simple categories of guilty and innocent began to blur into something far more complex. 3 weeks after their arrival, the 17 women had recovered sufficiently for transfer to a permanent prisoner facility.
Major Riley certified each as medically stable, though she noted in her reports that all showed signs of prolonged malnutrition that would require continued monitoring. The morning of their scheduled departure, Mitchell arrived to find Margarete Hoffman standing by the window, dressed in a clean Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform that had been laundered and mended by the hospital staff. She turned as he entered, and he was struck by how different she looked from the skeletal figure who had stumbled off the transport truck. Her face had filled out, color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes, while still carrying sadness, no longer held the hollow emptiness of complete despair. "Corporal Mitchell, I wanted to speak with you before we leave. To give you something." She held out a small object wrapped in cloth. "It isn't much, but it's the only thing of value I still possess." Mitchell unwrapped the cloth to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in a university gown standing beside an older couple, clearly her parents. "I can't accept this. It's your family." "Precisely why I want you to have it." Margarete's voice was steady but intense. "My parents are dead. The bombing raids on Munich. I have no one left, no family to remember them except me. If something happens to me, if I don't survive whatever comes next, this photograph will be lost. But if you keep it, then someone will remember that these people existed, that they were good people who loved their daughter and hoped for her future. They deserve to be remembered as more than casualties of a war they never wanted." Mitchell looked at the photograph, at the proud parents and their daughter on her graduation day, a moment of hope captured before the darkness descended. "What was your father's name?" "Heinrich Hoffman. He was a postal clerk. My mother was Anna. She taught piano lessons to neighborhood children. They were ordinary people who lived ordinary lives until history swept them away." Margarete's voice broke slightly. "Please, let them be remembered." Mitchell carefully rewrapped the locket and placed it in his pocket. "I'll keep it safe, and when this is all over, when you're released, I'll return it to you.
You're going to survive, Margarete. You're going to teach mathematics to students who need to learn how to think critically. Your parents would want that. Before Margarete could respond, Lieutenant Chen entered to announce that the transport had arrived. The 17 women were assembled in the hospital corridor, each carrying a small bundle of possessions. They looked drastically different from their arrival state, healthier, cleaner, but also more aware of the uncertain future that awaited them. Private Goldstein distributed Red Cross parcels to each woman, packages containing basic toiletries, writing paper, and a small German-English dictionary. "These are yours to keep," Goldstein told them in her careful German. "Where you're going, you'll be treated according to international standards, regular meals, medical care, the right to send and receive letters. It won't be pleasant, but you won't be mistreated." Greta Schumacher, the banker's daughter, stepped forward hesitantly. "Why are you being kind to us, after everything you've learned about what happened? The camps, the murders. You're Jewish. Your people suffered the most. How can you stand to be in the same room with us?" Goldstein was silent for a long moment, and Mitchell saw her struggle with the question.
Finally, she spoke, and her words carried the weight of hard-won understanding. "My grandmother used to say that hatred is a poison you drink yourself while hoping it will kill your enemy. I could hate you. I could treat you with cruelty and tell myself it was justice, but that wouldn't bring back my family. It wouldn't undo what happened. It would just add more suffering to a world that already has far too much." She paused, meeting Greta's eyes directly. "You asked me how I can stand to be in the same room with you? The truth is, some days I can't. Some days I look at you and all I see is everyone I lost. But then I remember that my grandmother didn't survive Ravensbrück so that I could become someone who inflicts suffering on others. She survived so that I could be better than that. So I choose to be better, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The transport to the permanent POW facility was nothing like the nightmarish journey that had brought the women to Heidelberg. A proper bus with seats and windows replaced the cargo truck. They received sandwiches and water for the journey. An American nurse accompanied them to ensure their medical needs would be met. It was a small thing, this basic human decency, but for women who had expected torture or execution, it represented something profound. Evidence that their captors were capable of maintaining civilized standards even toward defeated enemies. The prisoner facility itself was a converted military barracks outside Mannheim, surrounded by wire fencing but equipped with proper dormitories, washing facilities, and a mess hall. The camp commandant, Colonel Robert Hayes, was a career officer who had fought through North Africa and Sicily before being assigned to prisoner administration. He gathered the new arrivals in the administration building for orientation, speaking in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of international law. You will be treated humanely. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will be permitted to send and receive letters subject to censorship. You will not be tortured or abused. In return, you will follow camp regulations, perform assigned work duties, and conduct yourselves in accordance with military discipline." He paused, his expression hardening slightly. "You will also be required to attend educational sessions about the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. These sessions are not optional. The United States military believes that Germany's reconstruction requires Germans to confront honestly what was done in their name. This process begins here." The educational sessions that Colonel Hayes described were part of a broader Allied denazification program, an attempt to fundamentally reshape German political culture by forcing collective confrontation with Nazi atrocities. For the women in the camp, these sessions became the most difficult part of their captivity. Each week, they were assembled in the camp's largest room to view documentary footage from liberated concentration camps, to hear testimony from survivors, to examine evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale.
Margarete Hoffman sat through the first session with her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. The footage from Bergen-Belsen showed corpses stacked like cordwood, survivors who were little more than animated skeletons. British soldiers weeping as they tried to provide aid to people too far gone to save. When the lights came back on, several women were openly sobbing. Others sat in stunned silence. Grete Schumacher had vomited into a bucket and now sat pale and shaking. Captain Daniel Weaver, the education officer responsible for these sessions, let the silence stretch for several minutes before speaking. What you've just seen is the reality of the regime you served, not propaganda, not exaggeration, the actual documented result of Nazi policies that you helped implement through your service. I'm not showing you this to be cruel. I'm showing you this because you need to understand what your choices enabled. Hilde Wagner, the woman whose father had been imprisoned for socialist activities, spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. We didn't know. I swear to you, we didn't know it was this bad. They told us the camps were for enemies of the state, for security threats. We thought it was like internment, harsh but not murder. Did you ask?
When you transmitted orders directing resources to these camps, did you question where those resources were going? When supply trains passed through your communications networks heading east, did you wonder what they carried and why they never came back full? When your Jewish neighbors disappeared, did you demand to know where they'd been taken? Captain Weaver's voice was hard but not cruel. I'm not saying you personally operated the gas chambers. I'm saying you were part of a system that required millions of individual Germans to look away, to not ask questions, to accept convenient lies rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. That's what enabled this. Not a handful of monsters, but millions of ordinary people who chose not to know. The weight of collective guilt that settled over the camp in the weeks following these sessions was almost physical. Several women stopped eating, requiring medical intervention. 2 attempted suicide and were placed under constant observation. The camp's psychiatrist, Major Edward Morrison, found himself overwhelmed with patients struggling to reconcile their self-image as decent people with the evidence of what their service had enabled. Margarete Hoffman became one of Major Morrison's regular patients. In their sessions, conducted in a small office overlooking the camp yard, she struggled to articulate the cognitive dissonance that threatened to break her. I believed I was serving my country. I believed the Allied blockade after the First War had starved German children, that Versailles had humiliated us unjustly, that we had the right to reclaim our strength and dignity. I believed the propaganda about Jewish conspiracies and Bolshevik threats. I believed these things because believing them was easier than questioning the authorities who told me what to think. And now? Morrison prompted gently. Now I understand that I was a coward, not because I served, but because I never questioned my service. I took the easy path of obedience rather than the hard path of moral examination. Every message I transmitted, I told myself I was just doing my duty, just following orders, just being a good German. I never asked where those orders led or what they accomplished. That willful ignorance is my crime. Morrison leaned forward. What will you do with that understanding? I don't know. Some days I think I should have died in the initial starvation, that survival itself is a form of unearned mercy. Other days I think perhaps survival is the harder punishment, that I'm meant to live with this knowledge, to spend the rest of my life trying to atone for what I enabled. She looked out the window at the other prisoners moving through the yard. Corporal Mitchell told me I would teach mathematics, that I would help young people learn to think critically. But how can I teach anyone anything when I failed so catastrophically to think critically myself? Perhaps precisely because you failed. You understand now what happens when people stop questioning authority, when they accept convenient lies rather than confronting difficult truths. That's a lesson you're uniquely qualified to teach. The camp routine settled into a rhythm over the following months. Morning roll call, work assignments in the camp laundry and kitchens, afternoon educational sessions, evening free time for letter writing and recreation. The American guards maintained professional distance but weren't cruel. The food was adequate if not abundant. Medical care was readily available. It was, as Private Goldstein had promised, treatment according to international standards. Yet for many prisoners, the physical comfort made the psychological burden more difficult to bear. Hilda Wagner expressed this paradox during one group session. When we were starving in transit, I could focus on immediate survival. Will I get food? Will I get water? Will I live through the day? Now that those needs are met, I have nothing to distract me from thinking about what we did. The Americans feed us 3 meals daily while showing us footage of concentration camp prisoners who were systematically starved to death. The contrast forces us to confront our complicity in a way that cruelty never could. This observation reflected something that American occupation authorities were slowly learning, that revenge satisfied an immediate emotional need but accomplished little toward long-term reconstruction, while justice, combined with basic human decency, created space for genuine moral reckoning. The women in that camp, well-fed and humanely treated while being forced to confront the atrocities their service had enabled, underwent a transformation that would have been impossible if their captors had simply mirrored Nazi cruelty.
Corporal Mitchell visited the camp regularly as part of his duties coordinating prisoner records. During these visits, he often spoke with Margarete Hoffman, their conversations ranging from her growing understanding of what had happened to her speculations about Germany's future. In one conversation that Mitchell recorded in his diary, Margarete articulated what many German prisoners were beginning to realize. Your mercy is more devastating than your cruelty would have been. If you had tortured us, starved us, treated us as we deserved, we could have maintained our victim narrative. We could have told ourselves that both sides committed atrocities, that war itself was the crime rather than our specific choices. But you didn't do that. You fed us when we were starving. You provided medical care when we were sick. You treated us humanely while showing us evidence of our inhumanity. That contrast makes it impossible to escape responsibility. You forced us to see ourselves clearly, and what we see is deeply shameful. Mitchell considered this carefully before responding. I don't think the goal is shame. I think it's understanding. You can't build a better future on shame alone. You need to understand how it happened, how ordinary people like you made choices that enabled extraordinary evil, so that you can make different choices going forward. And you believe that's possible? That people like me can be trusted to make better choices? I believe people are capable of learning from their mistakes if given the opportunity. The question is whether you'll take that opportunity or waste it on self-pity and resentment. This conversation reflected a broader debate occurring throughout the occupation zones about how to handle defeated Germans. Some Allied officials advocated harsh punishment and permanent restriction of German sovereignty. Others argued for a more rehabilitative approach that combined accountability with support for reconstruction. The camp where Margarete and the others were held represented the latter philosophy. Firm confrontation with Nazi crimes, combined with humane treatment and opportunities for education. By the autumn of 1945, with the Nuremberg trials underway and the full scope of Nazi atrocities becoming public knowledge, the international community watched to see whether rehabilitation was possible or whether Germany remained fundamentally corrupted by 12 years of Nazi rule. The women in that Mannheim camp represented a test case. Could former Nazi auxiliaries be transformed into citizens of a democratic Germany, or would they remain forever tainted by their association with Hitler's regime? The answer began to emerge in the letters these women wrote to family members who had survived the war. Margarete Hoffman's correspondence with a cousin in Bavaria, preserved in Allied archives, shows a progression from defensive justification to genuine moral reckoning. Her early letters contained phrases like, "We didn't know," and "We were just following orders." By late 1945, her tone had shifted dramatically. In one letter, she wrote,
I can no longer hide behind ignorance. I chose not to know because knowing would have required me to act, and acting would have been dangerous. That choice, repeated by millions of Germans, created the machinery of genocide. We are all responsible. This evolution wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained defensive, insisting they bore no responsibility for crimes they hadn't personally committed. Others descended into despair, unable to reconcile their actions with their conscience. But a significant portion, perhaps 30% according to Major Morrison's estimates, underwent genuine ideological transformation. They began to question not just Nazi policies, but the authoritarian mindset that had made those policies possible. The educational sessions evolved to include not just documentation of Nazi crimes, but exploration of how democratic societies functioned. Captain Weaver brought in copies of the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and other foundational documents of democratic governance. He organized discussions about individual rights, the importance of questioning authority, and the role of free press in preventing government abuses. These sessions created cognitive frameworks that many prisoners had never encountered. Greta Schumacher, whose father had been a Nazi Party member, found herself fascinated by the concept of constitutional limits on government power. We were taught that the Führer principle, absolute authority flowing from a single leader, was the natural and efficient form of government. The idea that power should be deliberately divided and checked, that citizens should have rights that even the government cannot violate, this was presented to us as weakness and chaos. Now I understand it's a safeguard against the very tyranny we enabled. As winter approached and the first war crimes trials concluded, the Allied authorities began releasing lower-level prisoners who were deemed unlikely to threaten the occupation. The 17 women who had arrived in Heidelberg starving and desperate were among those being considered for release. Each underwent extensive interviews to assess their genuine transformation versus mere performance of repentance. Margarete Hoffman's final interview was conducted by Colonel Hayes himself, a reflection of the camp commander's personal interest in her case. He had read the reports from Major Morrison, Captain Weaver, and the various guards who had interacted with her over the months. Now he wanted to assess her directly.
Tell me what you've learned during your time here, Obergefreiter Hoffman. Margarete took a deep breath before answering. I've learned that I was just following orders is not a defense, but an admission of moral failure. I've learned that my duty was not to my superior officers, but to my own conscience, and that I betrayed that duty through willful ignorance. I've learned that democracy isn't weakness, but the recognition that no human being should have unlimited power over others. Most importantly, I've learned that my future actions matter more than my past failures, that the only way to honor those who died because of the regime I served is to ensure such a regime never rises again. And how do you propose to do that? By teaching, by speaking honestly about what happened and how it happened, by helping young Germans understand that authority must always be questioned, that convenient lies are more dangerous than uncomfortable truths, that each of us bears responsibility for the society we create through our daily choices. She met his eyes directly. I cannot undo my service to the Nazi regime, but I can spend the rest of my life ensuring that future generations understand how it happened and how to prevent its recurrence. Colonel Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're being released next week. You'll be required to register with local authorities and submit to periodic interviews to ensure you're not engaging in Nazi activities. Beyond that, you're free to rebuild your life. He paused. Corporal Mitchell left something for you. He's been transferred stateside, but he wanted you to have this. He handed her a small package. Inside was her family's locket and a letter. Margarete's hands shook as she read Mitchell's words. I'm returning this to you because you're going to survive and build the future your parents hoped for. Use your second chance wisely. Remember that mercy isn't weakness,
and that the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves to remain human in circumstances that would excuse inhumanity. Your friend, James Mitchell. The release of Margarete and the others came in December 1945, almost 8 months after their near-death arrival in Heidelberg. They emerged into a Germany that was barely recognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, millions displaced, the entire social and political order collapsed and being rebuilt under Allied supervision. For women who had served the Nazi regime, finding employment or social acceptance would be extraordinarily difficult. Many Germans viewed former auxiliaries as traitors who had survived while their brothers and fathers died. Allied authorities remained suspicious of anyone with Wehrmacht connections. Yet Margarete and several others from her group persevered. She eventually found a position teaching mathematics at a girls' school in Stuttgart, though she had to withhold her wartime service from her application. In her classroom, she implemented the lessons learned during her imprisonment, teaching her students not just mathematical principles, but critical thinking skills, the importance of questioning authority, and the dangers of accepting convenient lies rather than confronting difficult truths. Years later, in 1963, Margarete published a memoir titled Messages of War that detailed her service as a signals auxiliary and her subsequent transformation during American captivity. The book became required reading in many German schools as part of the ongoing effort to help younger generations understand how ordinary people had enabled Nazi atrocities. In the introduction, she wrote words that captured the essence of her journey. I was saved not by harshness, but by mercy. Not by revenge, but by justice tempered with human decency. My American captors showed me that it was possible to hold people accountable while still treating them humanely. This lesson, learned in a prison camp, became the foundation for everything I later taught my students about building a democratic society. The story of those 17 women who arrived starving in Heidelberg and left transformed 8 months later represents something larger than their individual experiences. It illustrates a profound truth about how ideological change occurs not through forced conversion or brutal punishment, but through the patient combination of accountability and human decency. Corporal James Mitchell's instinctive decision to feed starving prisoners set in motion a chain of events that helped reshape at least some small corner of post-war German society. The contrast between what these women expected from American captivity and what they actually received created a cognitive dissonance that made genuine moral reckoning possible. If their captors had been the demons Nazi propaganda described, the women could have maintained their victim narrative and avoided confronting their complicity. But faced with captors who showed mercy while demanding accountability, who provided for their physical needs while forcing them to examine their moral failures, they had no psychological escape from responsibility. This approach wasn't universally successful. Many German prisoners remained unrepentant, and the broader denazification program had mixed results at best. But for those who were genuinely transformed, like Margarete Hoffman, the combination of humane treatment and moral accountability created something that neither approach alone could have achieved: genuine understanding of their role in enabling atrocity and genuine commitment to ensuring it never happened again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.